Tell us about the group for people maybe who don't know anything about this organization. What do you do here?
So the National Employment Law Project, NELP, is a national research, education, and advocacy organization that focuses on issues affecting low-wage workers, raising the minimum wage, providing a strong social safety net during periods of job loss, unemployment insurance, and the like, fighting the practice of wage theft, blowing the whistle on employer misclassification of employees as independent contractors, do a lot of work around economic development and making sure that economic development generates good jobs that pay living wages.
Some very interesting things for our audience, especially talking about misclassification, especially talking about wage theft. Let's come back to misclassification. First off, when you talk about wage theft, I think our audience understands what that means. How often do you get complaints about it? That's got to be a daily occurrence. What's the volume of complaints about that, and how do you respond to it, and can anything really be done? We've had cases in Houston where somebody, for example, went to get their paycheck and they had a gun pulled on them by their employer. These kind of things happen a lot?
Yeah. Well, we don't get a lot of direct complaints because we're a national organization and we do a lot of research and then provide a lot of technical support to organizations locally like the Workers' Defense Project, where something like that is more likely to happen. Somebody will hear about a really egregious situation. When you ask about how often does it happen, we were involved in a survey 3 years ago in Chicago, LA, and New York City, which are the three largest cities in the country and have the largest concentrations of low-wage workers. And we surveyed over 4,000 low-wage workers to test exactly how often the practice of wage theft occurs. And it was really astonishing. We found that a quarter of those workers had not been paid the minimum wage in the preceding work week, that of those who had worked overtime, 3/4 had not gotten overtime pay, and these were people who were eligible for overtime pay. High incidences of making people work off the clock without being paid at all, denying meal breaks that were required under state law. And the other thing we found that it's not wage theft, but it sort of goes hand in glove with it, is that for workers who were injured on the job, which happens a lot in construction, that there was a very low percentage who actually got workers' compensation benefits. Only 12% got workers' compensation. And among those who were injured and presumably should have gotten it but didn't apply for it, half of them who didn't apply said the reason they didn't apply was they were afraid they'd be retaliated against by their employer. So in the low-wage labor market, there's just a lot of abuse of workers. There's the wage theft, there's workplaces are often not safe and healthy, and when people are injured, they don't have recourse to workers' compensation.
When I've talked to some of these injured workers, they'll point out the just sort of tragic irony of the fact that if they're working on a project and a piece of the building falls, that's insured. Right. But often the person who dropped it is not.
Well, and if you think about it, wage theft as an example, if somebody is a day laborer or somebody like that is riding a bike to the job site, if the bike is stolen, that's a crime. But if the wages are stolen, we don't treat that as if it were a crime. We don't in society. And it is every bit as much a crime against the person who's affected.
This issue of misclassification, what needs to be done about that? Some call it payroll fraud, others say it's intentional misclassification of employees. Explain from your vantage point, what actually needs to be done? Is it simply an issue of enforcing the law, or does some other law need to be written?
It's both. There is, under existing law, if employers misclassify their employees as independent contractors and as a result don't provide their benefits, don't withhold income tax, don't make unemployment payments and the like, under existing law in the states, state labor agencies or state attorneys general can go in and can find those employers and require them to reclassify their employees properly and secure back pay for the workers if back wages are in order. So enforcement is part of it, because there are certain tests that define whether someone's an employee. One of the problems in this area is that the tests differ from state to state, and they differ under employment law and tax law. So there's some confusion, but there are some mechanisms, enforcement mechanisms for addressing it. But there are also problems under existing federal law, particularly with respect to tax law, which creates safe harbors for employers who have misclassified their employees, that these safe harbors protect them from having any kind of penalties applied retroactively for misclassification. So we need to address that situation as well. We need to create incentives not to misclassify, as opposed to incentives to misclassify.
And this issue of misclassification, this has gotten worse and worse
Absolutely.
over the last 30 years or so. You know, the erosion of the middle class happens on that same downward trajectory, right? And we've lost the employer-employee relationship in a lot of cases because people feel I can be entrepreneurial, I can be my own boss, but there are a lot of risks that go along with that, and a lot of the protections you used to would have, now you don't.
Right. And you know, some people legitimately are independent contractors, and they want to be, and they are entrepreneurial, and for whatever reasons it's the position they want. But we see misclassification in all kinds of industries. We see situations in which custodians and janitors who work for a company are told that they are independent contractors, and they essentially have to buy a floor to clean from the contracting company, buy their own supplies, and then they get paid a flat rate, even though the contractor controls every single thing they do. We see a lot of misclassification in construction, as you know, and it goes all the way down the line. So it really, as you say, it is really a factor that has contributed to the decline of the middle class and the sort of spread in inequality in our society, that the more attenuated the employment relationship has become, and the less responsibility that the employer who really controls the terms and conditions of employment is willing to assume, the more vulnerable the workers at the bottom of the ladder are.
And what would you define as a bad job? Well, you know, what factors go into saying, okay, you know what, this is a job that a person shouldn't have this unless a few things change? Right.
Well, so I think any job has the potential to be a good job. And that what makes jobs that could be good jobs bad jobs are low wages, which may not always get paid, are dangerous and dirty and unsafe and unhealthy working conditions, are limits on opportunities for training and education and advancement, are situations in which one is subjected to different forms of discrimination and harassment. And particularly as I think about immigrant workers and undocumented immigrant workers, jobs in which workers have to fear that if they complain, they will be fired, or worse, they could be deported. Those are bad jobs. They don't have to be. Those are bad. I mean, we tell our children, you're not a bad child, you've just done some bad things, right? So the jobs don't have to be bad jobs, but there are bad things associated with them that keep them from being good jobs.
Yeah, well, and you know, everybody would hope that there could be competition, that you can have a free marketplace, that people can compete for jobs, and that businesses can compete against each other. But unless some of these things are fixed, like the wage theft, like the misclassification, and some other things, people aren't necessarily even playing the same game. It's not that the rules are different. They're one's on a baseball field and one's on a football field.
Exactly, and one is someplace where there are no rules at all. I mean, I think one of the realities is that throughout much of the low-wage labor market, whether it's residential construction or whether it's home health care or restaurants or janitorial or landscaping, that a lot of an employer, that these are very labor-intensive jobs, and a lot of employers' costs are in the cost of wages for the folks who are working for them. So the way that employers compete to keep their costs down is by shortchanging wages for their workers, or misclassifying them as independent contractors, or failing to provide, make payments into unemployment insurance and workers' compensation, so that, you know, workers are injured or become unemployed, actually have no safety net to fall back on. So I think that is a reality in the low-wage labor market, that so much of the competition is so intense. You know, a lot of this work in the low-wage labor market now is done by contractors. It used to be done in-house by a corporation. and they've contracted out various aspects of their work. And of course, this is how construction has always operated. But contractors compete against each other, bid against each other, and they get a competitive advantage from keeping their wages down.
Well, let me put this out there in a deliberately broad way, because I know you've been in a lot of these discussions. Rebuilding the middle class, other than some of the things we've already talked about, what needs to happen to make that a reality, that we can have that again?
I think we need to restore responsible and appropriate regulation in the workforce, and that means having a minimum wage that actually is has its value restored to what it was 30 years ago, and that keeps up with rising costs as the cost of living goes up. And the reason that's so important is not just because of the people who work at the minimum wage, which is a few million people, but it's because it lines the bottom of the labor market. It is the floor for wages across the bottom of the labor market. And what we're seeing is that 60% of the new job growth is in low-wage jobs. So it's really critical to have a strong wage floor, and the way you do that is to have a strong minimum wage. So raising the minimum wage, strengthening the protections against wage theft and misclassification, strengthening the penalties for failure to provide safe and healthy workplaces, strengthening protections for employee benefits like health care and retirement security, restoring the right of workers to organize into unions and bargain collectively. This was a sort of a policy agenda that came about in the New Deal and was built on after over the next several decades, and it's really been eroded and sort of etched away in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years, and we just really need to restore that framework, which really was so critical in building, the strongest middle class the world had ever known. And that's what we need to do again.
Well, and since the reality on the ground is different from what it was then, is there a new way forward from what we saw then? Maybe the new way forward is that responsible businesses. I mean, you were on a panel yesterday here where there was a businessman talking about these exact same principles. Maybe it's responsible businesses need to see each other doing it and get a sense of community that, hey, if I'm doing things the right way, there are other people who are doing things the right way. They need to get that sense that this is accepted. People do on multiple levels that it is good for the workers, and in the long term, it's good for business.
Absolutely. I think that one of the guy named Jared Bernstein, who is a fairly prominent economist and is on the board of our organization, some years ago wrote a book that said there are basically two schools of economics. One is yo-yo, you're on your own, and the other is wit, we're in this together. And I think what we need to do is return to a notion of we're in this together, that what is good for workers is actually good for employers too. And this is what Mike yesterday on the panel was talking. Mike Holland, that having a well-educated workforce, having a workforce in which people feel like that their investment in becoming better skilled will be higher wages and better jobs is really a good business practice. So I do think that restoring that sense among businesses that we are all in this together, and that having business practices that actually enable your employees to live good, solid, sustainable middle-class lives is a good business practice, is profitable, and will build a stronger economy overall. And I think the other thing we need to do that we don't do enough of is to reward those employers who do the right things. That when you have a good employer who's bidding on a public contract, and that employer's bid might be a little bit higher because that employer pays decent wages, and that employer is competing against bottom feeders, well, the good employer ought to get the public contract. The good employer ought to get some kind of privileging or preferencing in the bidding process that recognizes the fact that that employer is going to use these public dollars to create good middle-class jobs. And that's an important role for the government to be playing. The government's not creating the jobs, but it is recognizing that this particular bidder is going to create the kind of jobs we need for our society.
Backstopping the good guys.
Right, exactly. And we don't do that, and we should.
Christine Owens, thanks for taking the time. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.